morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining today's event on enhancing government effectiveness and transparency, the fight against corruption. I am Ed Olowokere, Global Director of Governance at the World Bank. The World Bank is reaffirming its commitment to helping countries control corruption. We are embarking on some new initiatives, and the global report we are presenting today takes our support further, providing practical case studies on approaches that have worked in certain contexts. Helping governments to improve effectiveness and transparency has been central to much of the work of the World Bank Group. Fighting corruption within the public sector is an especially important element of that. I'm really honored to be here today with a distinguished panel of speakers, including Mary Pangestu, the World Bank Managing Director for Policy, Development and Partnerships. Hada Ismail, the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and Director General of the United Nations Office at Vienna. Delia Rubio, Chair, Transparency International. Rajni Babpai, Lead Public Sector Specialist, World Bank. Bernard Myers, Senior Public Sector Specialist, World Bank. The main objective of this report is to support governments and civil society in addressing corruption risks. We recognize that part of the challenge for tackling corruption is that government officials may often be benefiting from the system as it is. Hence, this report aims to create a broad-based platform on which to engage many stakeholders, not limited to government officials, but including the private sector, civil society, and citizens at large. I will now turn to the World Bank Managing Director, Mary Pangestu, who will deliver the opening remarks for this event. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Edward. Good morning and good day to everyone. It's an honor for me to be here for the launch of the World Bank's global flagship report, Enhancing Government Effectiveness and Transparency, the Fight Against Corruption. This is, as you know, happening on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. The report is the culmination of many months of work by our governance global practice and the World Bank Group Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub in Malaysia. Let me take this opportunity to thank the government of Malaysia for their continued support to the joint research partnership with the World Bank Group. I'm glad that my colleagues Ghada Wali from the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and Delia Rubio of Transparency International can join us today. The World Bank's mandate to eliminate poverty and ensure shared prosperity means that we have been and we will continue to work with countries to control corruption. This is by no means a new issue, and we have come a long way to addressing it. But of course, there is still much more to do. And the principles for controlling corruption are well known: transparency and accountability, open government and civil society monitoring, detection, and enforcement. However, we also know the strategies for applying them on the ground can vary depending on the country context. The world is also changing, becoming hyper-globalized and seeing the advent and penetration of new technologies, which offer both challenges and opportunities. These changes have called for a rethink on how we can help countries control corruption. With these ideas in mind, we recently announced a reinvigorated approach. We need to refresh our approach. And therefore, the World Bank released last December a set of anti-corruption initiatives, reaffirming commitment to a development priority. These initiatives identified areas where the bank should refresh approaches that are showing results, scale up those that are emerging and showing promise, or innovate where fresh thinking is needed. The anti-corruption initiatives broaden the bank's focus beyond developing countries to also include financial centers, take on the politics of corruption more openly than before. This is, all of us will agree, one of the most hardest things to do. Harness new technologies to understand, address, and prevent corruption, and integrate the insights of behavioral social science. In addition, and of particular relevance today, the initiatives note the importance of learning and gravitating towards global standards on topics such as beneficial ownership transparency, procurement reform, and others. To move towards those standards, we need to learn from cases, from what works and what doesn't work, where, how, and why. This report is being launched also at a time when corruption risks are rising, with the policy responses to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the current emergency phase, the response has resulted in large-scale spending by governments to procure medical supplies and other emergency needs, sometimes or oftentimes without adhering to the regular checks and balances because of speed. While speed is understandable, without proper controls, it exposes governments to a variety of corruption risks that may undermine the effectiveness of their responses. The strains placed on the public sector in responding to the current situation present enormous opportunities for corruption to flourish, which can lead to theft, wastage, and misuse of scarce resources. The challenge will be how to balance the needed rapid and appropriate emergency response to the COVID-19 virus whilst having checks and balances in place. Further down the road, as countries embark on a road of recovery, policymakers will face the challenge of reactivating the economy in the context of large amounts of debt as well as huge fiscal stress. So how can governments use scarce fiscal resources, how to choose who to assist, how they should be assisted, how can we prevent leakages becomes a very important question. As in every crisis, this is also an opportunity to build back, to build a clean, accountable, and transparent government by introducing the highest standards of integrity and plugging the entry points that allow corruption to flourish. And this is really crucial given the current context of a limited fiscal space, how the billions of dollars lost to corruption can be spent on reviving the economy and ensuring that the poor and vulnerable groups who suffer disproportionately due to the crisis as well as corruption are protected. So this is the context that the World Bank is launching the report, Enhancing Government Effectiveness and Transparency, the Fight Against Corruption, where we highlight the importance of complementing the traditional methods of dealing with corruption with advanced ones like GovTech, e-procurement, asset and income disclosure, and beneficiary ownership. And we look at various countries and their experiences like Somalia, Bangladesh, Colombia, Ukraine, and Romania, where they have had successes in addressing corruption, even in the most challenging and fragile environments. For example, in Bangladesh, the implementation of the e-government procurement, combined with increased transparency and citizen participation, halved the number of single bidder tenders, which improved competition significantly, increased the number of contracts awarded to non-local firms, and led to better negotiated prices with successful bidders. Of course, the main beneficiaries are the people in the country. The country case studies included in this report provide guidance on the how of reform, which is as important as the what of reform. An effective anti-corruption strategy requires a multi-pronged approach, combining sector-specific interventions and transparency and accountability measures that apply to the whole public sector. 6 cross-cutting drivers of anti-corruption reforms have been identified also from the case studies in this report. First, Strong and determined political leadership is needed to provide vision and support greater integrity in the face of opposition from vested interests. Second, more capable institutions to provide checks and balances and foster accountability. Third, greater transparency through open government policies and access to information, which helps make corrupt actions harder to hide and contributes to their prevention. Fourth, it is important to focus on corruption at the micro level and its manifestation in specific sectors or functions, and to change the incentives of the perpetrators. Changing behavior, as we all know, is really one of the hardest challenges we have. Fifth, technology helps establish accountability for a wide range of transactions, allows us to have many things being online and not face-to-face and so on, and helps to standardize processes and captures comprehensive data. Sixth, fostering collaboration among multiple stakeholders, including across international borders, helps achieve greater success. Are we succeeding? As with many areas, this is work in progress, but progress has been made, and we need to continue to make sure to know what is working well and what is working less well, and to measure corruption in various manifestations, as well as track the implementation of approaches to controlling corruption. We need to continue improving our approaches to measuring the impact of corruption mitigation efforts. We need to highlight and celebrate success stories because it will lead to a demonstration effect and hopefully the emergence of new champions. And we also need to continue to raise awareness globally to sustain the momentum of the fight against corruption. Achieving long-term economic growth and shared prosperity, which is really the vision of the World Bank and of many of us who work in development, will require us to work with our partners in government, private sector, and civil society to address corruption and its corrosive impacts. I hope the recommendations and lessons learned from this report will help us advance our collective cause to fight corruption. And the main beneficiaries, we always have to remember, are the people in these various countries. So once again, looking forward to the discussion today, and thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you, Managing Director Mary, for setting the scene for today's event with those remarks. For those who just joined our event, I am Ed Olowokere, Global Director for Governance at the World Bank Group. I will now turn to UNODC Executive Director, Hada Wali, to share our reflections. Hada.
Thank you very much. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from Vienna. My thanks to our World Bank colleagues for inviting me to the launch of this important global report. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime is proud to be a long-term partner of the World Bank through the Stolen Asset Recovery or STAR initiative, which helps to end safe havens for corrupt funds. International financial institutions play an absolutely crucial role in supporting countries to prevent corruption. Building and strengthening broad partnerships with the World Bank, as well as with civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders, has been a top priority for me since I started as UNODC Executive Director in February. And I'm glad I could join you today for this timely discussion on enhancing government effectiveness and transparency. The world stands at an inflection point for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals on time, facing increased burdens with fewer resources as our societies are still reeling from the continuing COVID-19 crisis. According to the latest Goalkeepers report from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, extreme poverty has gone up by 7% in just a few months because of the global pandemic, ending 20 years of progress. This global report thus comes at a critical moment, and I say critical for two reasons. One, with the COVID crisis, the urgency to step up anti-corruption action has never been greater. Emergency funds are being rapidly disbursed to rescue economies and people in need, and fast-track spending is more susceptible to corruption. We have already seen from all regions of the world reports of corruption and fraud in the health sector. and with the procurement of vital medical equipment. Governments need enhanced guidance and support to address risks. The economic downturn is also heightening vulnerabilities to criminal exploitation and corruption. Transnational organized crime, including human trafficking and migrant smuggling, drug and firearms trafficking, wildlife crime, and maritime crime, are enabled by corruption. Women, minorities, and marginalized groups suffer from disproportionate and compounded impacts of corruption through exclusion from economic relief and access to justice, as well as from diverted and restricted healthcare, among other challenges. The second reason I believe we are at a critical moment is that even before the pandemic, momentum was gathering to improve global anti-corruption responses. Next year in June, the UN General Assembly will hold the first ever special session against corruption. The ongoing UNGAS preparatory process will benefit from the insights of IFIs, including the knowledge of the bank as captured in the report we are launching today. As part of preparations, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society are discussing problems and approaches, including to prevent corruption during crises. Even beyond agreeing on the importance of anti-corruption in the immediate COVID response, all stakeholders involved have clearly recognized that corruption results in an enormous loss of resources, often constituting a substantial share of state budgets, and thus helps to fuel poverty and inequality and frustration. The international community understands that we need to work together better to tackle these challenges, including by preventing corruption risks more effectively and by fully enforcing our existing frameworks. Moreover, in the lead up to UNGAS 2021, the Secretary General has spearheaded efforts to improve UN system-wide coordination to address corruption challenges at the global, regional, and national levels. We have adopted a common position on corruption, which was developed by the Global Task Force on Corruption led by UNODC, along with the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and UNDP, and which aims to improve delivery and impact of anti-corruption support to member states. Next month, the G20, under the presidency of Saudi Arabia, will be holding the first ministerial level meeting on anti-corruption. UNODC has been supporting the Saudi G20 presidency and the anti-corruption working group, including through the development of the Riyadh Initiative for enhancing international anti-corruption law enforcement cooperation. The initiative aims to create a global operational network that will build and enhance direct informal contacts between law enforcement practitioners, which can make a decisive difference in successfully pursuing complex cross-border corruption and money laundering cases. UNODC is also helping to develop a compendium of good practices on combating corruption in the response to COVID-19 based on survey of G20 countries. As we can see, corruption has been gaining prominence on the international agenda. Combating corruption is in fact an explicit target under SDG 16. More importantly, it has been recognized as a keystone action that can help governments get back on track to achieve the whole of the Sustainable Development Agenda. The COVID-19 crisis has intensified awareness of the acute dangers corruption poses to state budgets, to infrastructure and services, and to lives. It has increased understanding that robust anti-corruption and financial integrity efforts can support a more inclusive and sustainable COVID response and recovery. It is in this context that I very much welcome this assessment from the World Bank. By sharing examples of anti-corruption policies and tools, and how some countries have made headway in the fight against corruption in areas of public procurement and infrastructure, state-owned enterprises, customs, service delivery, and more, the report represents a very valuable resource. It shows that progress, albeit incremental, is possible, even in extremely challenging contexts, if there is political will and commitment. It also demonstrates that the fight against corruption must be strategic, systematic, and sustained. Topics highlighted by the report, including citizen engagement, technology, and the role of effectiveness of anti-corruption agencies, tax and audit administrations, and justice systems, as well as its focus on developing countries, are very pertinent from UNODC's perspective. The report's key messages resonate well with UNODC's experience as custodian of the UN Convention Against Corruption and its implementation review mechanism, and with how our office tailors technical assistance to member states. The Convention also promotes a holistic multi-stakeholder approach with an emphasis on solutions that address the specific needs and situation of a country. UNODC has moreover found that regional approaches to anti-corruption support can bring advantages such as enhanced peer learning. I was particularly interested in the report's suggestion for technology-supported reforms in developing countries and for identifying gaps in the use of new technologies such as big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, cloud-based platforms, biometrics, and fintech to better prevent and detect corruption. More integrated use of technologies in the fight against corruption, as well as addressing the threats and exploitable loopholes that come with new technologies, present evolving challenges that will keep us on our toes as governments seek to stay ahead of the criminals. Finally, as the report emphasizes, achieving long-term economic growth and sustainable development depends on partnerships, shared commitment, and trust between governments, the private sector, civil society, international and regional organizations, and communities. With this in mind, I look forward to exploring how we can work together to seek innovative solutions to prevent and tackle corruption for a fair and inclusive COVID recovery, to build back better and achieve the SDGs. Congratulations once again on this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hada. We are very proud of our partnership with UNODC and look forward to continue to strengthen it going forward for the benefit of all countries and people. For those who just joined, this is the World Bank Group's launch event on the global report entitled Enhancing Government Effectiveness and Transparency, the Fight Against Corruption. Rajni and Bernard, the TTL for the global report, will now present the report findings.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody from across the globe. This is Rajni from Malaysia. I will be presenting the report along with my other TTL, Bernard. I'm just going to share the screen and present a few slides. So why is corruption so important and why this report? Corruption continues to be important because it impacts everybody directly or indirectly. Every now and then, the world wakes up to one big scandal or the other. And each year, the scandal is bigger than before, more sophisticated than before. Before COVID hit us earlier this year, Airbus SE paid $4 billion as penalty for overseas bribery charges. Billions are lost to corruption, and they need to be diverted to development. The issue, as rightly mentioned by our esteemed speakers, has gained way heightened importance in the light of COVID. Governments across the globe are spending millions of dollars trying to deal with the health, economic, and social impact of COVID. And while this is the need of the hour, it also exposes them to a variety of risks, because right now governments are not able to follow the standard operating procedures. But what is a cause for worry that this could undermine the credibility of the government and even increase inequality and poverty and exacerbate differences between the rich and poor. Hence, the report is an attempt to address some of these issues and present some solutions. There is no single report that can completely do justice to a topic such as this, its expanse and depth. And therefore, the report had to be selective, and we focused on three broad areas. The first area covered the key sectors and functions of the government, where public sector spending is huge. These sectors are critical to an economy, and these are particularly the sectors that are bereft with corruption. The second part of report focuses on a few tools that have been effective in the fight against corruption. And the third part looks at three agencies that are the watchdogs for corruption. But before we delve into each of these, we want to present a few key messages from the report. The first message is progress is not always linear, which is quite understandable because when dealing with corruption, one faces a lot of opposition and change, but each step forward lays a key foundation which can be built upon. One of the key issues, and we feel one of the big contributions of the report, is the focus on the how of reform. I remember a head of the state once telling a World Bank delegation, "Don't give my people wings, tell them how to fly." And we have tried to attempt this in our report. Each case study details the implementation plan, which we believe should be of interest to practitioners. Collaboration within and across boundaries is key, and no single agency can do justice or can enable reform on its own. It is also quite important to keep the historical, economic, social, and political landscape of a country in mind for designing any effective anti-corruption strategy. And finally, as already mentioned, measuring progress is challenging, indices have limitations, and we need to continuously invest in coming up with more sophisticated and modern tools to measure corruption and its impact. With these few messages, we turn to part 1 of the report, which covers 5 key sectors. And not surprisingly, the first sector, of course, is procurement. Procurement entails huge spendings by governments, is often the epicenter of corruption. It is rammed with multiple entry points which are susceptible to corruption and creates wrong incentives for firms, distorts competition, and has a long-term detrimental impact on growth. So what has been done? What can be done? What works? EGP systems have presented quite an opportunity in this area, but with varying degrees of success. The reason being EGP systems themselves are not a solution unless and until they are complemented with other critical factors like overall transparency, increasing the frequency of audits, building capable institutions, as well as overcoming opposition to change and harnessing all the forces together, the public, the private, and the civil society. In Bangladesh, the recognition of corruption as an issue upfront was factored into the design of EGP system, which could be attributed to its success.
So public infrastructure provision is a critical government function that we included in the report. Why does it matter? Well, one reason is because global infrastructure financing needs are huge. Some estimates are $3 to $4 trillion annually are needed. To be able to meet that challenge, private sector participation is going to be critical. But of course, corruption or the perception of corruption undermines trust, and it is a strong disincentive to attracting quality investors and contractors. Now, procurement tends to get a lot of the attention, but in reality, just about every phase of the project cycle has its vulnerabilities to corruption. Now, we're not, next slide, please. Of course, the political economy challenges are quite critical, and we recognize that a broad alliance is needed in order to foster transparency and openness, employing a variety of tools. Political commitment is needed across the project cycle, but there's also opportunities to mobilize citizens and stakeholders, strengthening their hand through transparency and openness initiatives, and in doing so, to create a political momentum in order to encourage future reforms. We include case studies that are a little less country focused and a bit more policy focused. So for example, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, otherwise known as COST, features examples from Honduras, Thailand, and the Ukraine. But in addition, we share how countries around the world, and particularly in Latin America, have been trying to manage the corruption risk that occur in the renegotiation of PPP contracts. And then finally, we have examples from Colombia and how they've begun to employ open contracting in the infrastructure sector. State-owned enterprises are quite critical for providing management of natural resources in many countries, and yet we see that SOEs have often featured in many of the high-profile corruption scandals across the world. The diverted resources are often used to benefit political parties, political financing, which then in turn allows them to retain their positions. There are many factors that introduce corruption risk in SOEs. These include weak legal and regulatory frameworks, weak corporate governance, a lack of transparency and disclosure of SOE finances, as well as just ineffective government and citizen oversight. So how do we address this? Well, corruption can be quite entrenched, and the political economy to address it can be quite challenging. And therefore, sequencing of SOE reforms is really essential based on what the political and institutional feasibility allows to overcome those entrenched interests. Of course, improving corporate governance is an important building block, and that includes strengthening the legal and regulatory frameworks, professionalizing SOE boards of directors and senior management, among other measures that can increase or improve corporate governance and transparency. In some cases, though, it may be necessary to consider restructuring of SOEs or even privatization. But even privatization is not without risk, and that's possible when governments need to assure that there's a level playing field and integrity in the process. Well, customs administration is another government function that we felt was critical to include and often prone to corruption. Customs administration is vital for trade facilitation as well as protection of national borders, not to mention its role in revenue collection. Trade taxes, we estimate, can be up to 30 to 50% of revenues in many developing countries, and even more in many fragile states. Like in infrastructure, corruption is a strong disincentive for foreign investors who rely on the smooth import and export of goods across borders. Making it more challenging is that often officials have discretionary powers and the systems for accountability tend to be weak. So what do we do? Well, the report emphasizes that legal and technical reforms are absolutely necessary, but insufficient by themselves. I think the experiences that we show reveal that those have to be complemented by mechanisms that create appropriate incentives, that limit the discretion of public servants, and that target these informal networks of patronage and social control, which are often the real drivers of the behavior of customs officers.
The last of the 5 sectors that are covered in the report is service delivery. Now, service delivery is one of the key functions of the government, and at the end of the day, every government strives to provide high quality, timely services to its citizens. But what happens when these sectors are bereft with corruption? The poor and the vulnerable are most impacted, as can clearly be seen at the time of COVID. While the focus worldwide currently is on the health sector, it is important to note that corruption in service delivery manifests itself very differently from sector to sector, and strategies have to be designed accordingly sector-wise. To deal with service delivery, there are a few things that are cross-cutting which have worked quite well. The first one is the use of IT. Second is the change in incentives for service providers. And the third one is building coalitions. One example where coalitions work very well was the case of Nigeria, where the UNDP, the private shippers, and the 3 anti-corruption agencies worked together with the Nigerian government to improve functioning of Nigeria ports. Having covered the 5 sectors, we now look at a few tools that have been effective in their fight against corruption. And the first one is open government initiatives. Open government initiatives have been very successful in promoting an ethos of transparency, inclusiveness, and overall collaboration. They do help to build strong relationships between government and citizens, which increases the level of trust. However, does transparency in itself ensure accountability? Not necessarily, because that hinges on several other factors like civil space, political will, the institutional capacity, as well as presence of an active and vibrant media, freedom of speech, and other such factors. Social accountability mechanisms such as audits, surveys, citizen report card, grievance redress mechanisms have been extremely effective in promoting accountability and have been used quite widely, including those in World Bank projects. Two case studies in the report, one from Kenya and the other from Ethiopia, talk about how open budgeting and social accountability programs have led to an improvement in engaging citizens at the local level and building accountability bottom up. Another tool that is gaining increasing acceptance, a lot of COVID-related issues are being dealt through GovTech. It is becoming more important today for governments to provide services seamlessly without human interface than before. But this was always a solution to providing service without human interface and reducing corruption. It is a huge opportunity for those that have been left behind in the race. They can leapfrog and learn from early adopters as well as from their mistakes. For this to work, governments need to very quickly ramp up their capabilities and address 2 or 3 critical issues. One being breaking the technology silos. The second one, building capacities within the government that would enable government servants to use big data, cloud-based platforms, biometrics, and fintech, all of which can be a game changer, not just for service delivery, but also to address corruption.
So while the first 2 policy instruments were fairly broad-based, the next 3 are very focused and targeted. So asset and interest declaration systems, for example, have been used for preventing conflicts of interest and detecting illicit wealth for years. These are employed in many countries across the world. But let's be honest, in many of these cases, there's limited evidence of their real impact. Why do they have so little impact? Well, often this is a result of cumbersome filing procedures, crucial gaps in the disclosure forms, and a lack of transparency or enforcement. All these things combined limit the impact of these asset and interest declaration systems, which then only give a veneer of being an effective anti-corruption tool. So the report provides some critical guidance to practitioners and researchers on some key design questions that they should consider. And then we feature 2 case studies from Romania and Ukraine that highlight the impact of enforcement, digitization, and transparency. But moreover, they also tell a story about progress, setbacks, and further progress. Again, it's the journey of how they managed to get where they are. Beneficial ownership transparency is a growing important tool. The Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers have both highlighted how anonymous companies have been used to conceal corrupt proceeds across the world. Loopholes in one country or another around beneficial ownership transparency create these loopholes that then provide a safe haven for corruptors to hide their assets. Well, the Financial Action Task Force, FATFA, has said that beneficial ownership disclosure is a key tool for law enforcement to employ. This is not easy, though, and civil society organizations have been helping to solve some of these technical challenges that are involved in making these systems more open and available to the public. Now, the path is not easy, and the report presents 3 very diverse countries' examples and their journey and how they're approaching the challenges that they're facing: Nigeria, Slovakia, and the UK. We conclude this part 2 with a look at how tax administrations can have an impact on improving anti-corruption efforts, in particular by focusing on collaboration on tax crimes. The linkage between tax crimes is clear. Corrupt people do not generally report their income from corrupt activities. So FATFA has concluded that tax crimes can be a predicate offense for money laundering purposes. So in other words, a way to go after money laundering is to prosecute for tax crimes. Tax administrations can play a very important role in this in the fight against illicit financial flows in 2 ways. First, by increasing their sharing of data with other organizations, exchanging data with other organizations, and secondly, by allowing their tax data to be used as evidence in the prosecution of corruption. So in part 3 of the report, we look at the role of institutions have in fighting corruption.
So the first of the 3 institutions we look at are anti-corruption agencies. These have gained a lot of visibility and a huge amount of resources have been deployed to set them up. However, their impact is quite diverse, and in some cases, even limited. Most of the ACAs that have been set up do fall short of the UNCTAD standards that have been written up and set for these agencies. And there is still quite a bit of diversity between what kind of ACA model is the right one. In UK, the ACA was set up through the homegrown institutional architectural arrangements that already existed, whereas in Lithuania, a brand new agency was set up. It was a quasi-law enforcement agency which had strong leadership and technical expertise. The case studies that are presented in the report present 3 examples with very different models from UK, Lithuania, and Bhutan. However, the cross learnings between the 3 are that there are a few factors like political commitment, diagnosing the root cause of corruption and the nature of corruption in the country, whether it's petty or large or limited to a sector or spread across, and also an understanding of the country's landscape before such an agency is set up. A lot of governments also set up ACAs because it establishes a huge amount of credibility. The second set of institutions we looked at was the Supreme Audit Institutions that can play a huge role in detecting and preventing corruption. For the SAIs to be impactful and effective, they need to have the right mandate, the tools, the trust and political backing, and more importantly, the autonomy and independence to operate free from government interference. It is important to continuously invest in these institutions, both in terms of financial and human resources. As the perpetrators are smart, they find new and innovative ways of hiding illicit wealth. So our auditors need to be provided with the right tools and techniques, as well as human resources, to be able to unearth these hidden transactions and raise red flags early on.
So we conclude part 3 with a focus on the justice system. We all understand the importance of a well-functioning justice system in order to discourage corrupt behavior. The problem is that there's often a gap between the laws and their actual implementation. The justice system often suffers from under-resourcing, whether that's in terms of financial resources or human resources. So we emphasize that helping the justice system meet the challenge requires action on 3 levels: system-wide, across the criminal justice chain, and at the institutional levels, particularly where each institution begins to diagnose their performance bottlenecks and their vulnerabilities to internal corruption challenges. We leave with an important message that as corruption now transcends borders, that international cooperation between jurisdictions is going to be essential to fighting against cross-border corruption. Now, our concluding chapter of the report stresses some of the things that we hinted at in the introductory section, namely that corruption is stubborn and deeply rooted, but not intractable. Progress is possible, but progress may not necessarily come from the large, high-profile, visible initiatives, but also from the more focused efforts in sectors that often goes unobserved. Impact may not necessarily lead to a big jump in the global survey rankings. But it's really important for governments to combine sector-specific interventions plus the transparency and accountability measures that apply to the whole of the public sector. Well, there are no silver bullets and no panaceas, we recognize, but we did find in the case studies that progress was possible when they combined some combination of the following 6 drivers that Marie elaborated on in her opening remarks: political leadership, institutional capacity, transparency, which is often combined with citizen engagement, incentives to change behavior, technology, a collaboration that allows one to break down silos and even extends beyond national boundaries. The report proposes that governments really look at corruption at these 3 levels: sector-specific, also, secondly, sharpening the tools and policy instruments to make them more effective, and thirdly, looking at how to strengthen institutions. Fighting corruption is a collective responsibility in which we all play a part, but progress is possible, even in the most challenging environments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajni. Thank you, Bernard. This is the World Bank Group's launch event on the global report entitled Enhancing Government Effectiveness and Transparency, the Fight Against Corruption. Welcome to those who might just be joining us. Let me now call on Transparency International Chair, Delia Rubio, to share with us some of her reflections on what she has had so far and how our report can be of support to the work that Transparency International is doing to fight corruption. Over to you, Delia.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for the World Bank for the invitation, and congratulations for the team for a great job with the report. We were already talking about that, so congratulations. It's really welcome, and it's particularly welcome in this moment when corruption has been enhanced and strengthened in the midst of the pandemic. What we have seen is more corruption, in particularly related to the COVID response, and we are waiting to see, unfortunately, more corruption in the post-COVID recession recuperation that is being to come, I hope, soon. So welcome suggestions, recommendations on the part of the bank. And I'm sure we will have very soon an action plan from the bank in order to transform this and to use the power of the bank. You are a very powerful organization in order to push governments to adopt the recommendations, because they are useful, but we are really fed up, as I said, with commitments. And many of the governments commit to this kind of adoption of this kind of measures and tools that you are suggesting, but then the implementation is lacking, or they create the institutions or the watchdog oversight institution, but then the budget is not assigned to them, so they are lacking the capacity to act, or they lack independence, political independence, so they cannot perform their role. So it's not enough to say, okay, this is the recipe, and these are the successful examples, and these are the failures these countries commit and how they overcome the difficulties. It's needed to push governments, to press governments to really enforce this kind of solutions. So I am waiting for the concrete plan. I celebrate very much your stress on the importance of rules, but saying rules are not enough, which is really in many regions, in particularly in Latin America, my region, you find the what I say, it's like the belief that rules will solve problems. So you pass the law, problem is solved. And that's just the first part of the solving solution, or the solution of the problem. So rules are necessary, but they are not enough. Another thing that is very important in your report is that you mentioned political campaign, or money and politics, let's say, as one of the roots of corruption. In all the sectors you have selected to work on, which, as Rania said, are just part of the problem, because this is a really multi-cause problem and it operates in all sectors. But in all this, money and politics, campaign financing is crucial. So I celebrate that you highlight this, because sometimes governments don't pay attention to this aspect, which is already mentioned in the UNCTAD Convention and should be really important in addressing the problems. Private sector has an important role to play in this. And not only in infrastructure, as Bernard mentioned, but in general, we also say that corruption is like tango. You you need two to tango. And the private sector is the other actor there. So we have to stress the need to have business fighting against corruption with us. And in that sense, there are many tools, integrity pacts. We are using integrity pacts in many of the countries we operate. That's a possibility. And we are working for integrity beyond compliance, which has also to do with this view that you stress very well, that rules are not enough. So compliance as just fulfilling the law obligations is not enough. What we need is integrity. And it brings me back to one of the tools you mentioned. You mentioned the asset and interest disclosure. Of course, is one of the oldest tools that we have been using since 30 years almost now, fighting corruption. Of course, it's not enough, and it depends on how public these declarations are and how well done they are and how the oversight institution verify the content of this declaration. But this is just a little part of what we need, which is integrity in the public sector. Because we have, together with this, the revolving doors problems, the conflicts of interest, nepotism, clientelism, which are a big parcel of problems that cannot be addressed just by having a very good asset and interest declaration. That's just the first point. So we have to encourage governments to have a full vision of public integrity. And another thing that I think we have coming to the oversight institutions that it is very important to stress is that it is needed to put an end to impunity. As Gada mentioned, and Marie and all of you, and you have written that in the report, corruption affects the life, the everyday life, the possibilities, the rights of people. People suffer the consequences of corruption. That's clear. I would like to see, and Transparency has committed to that, to see that those perpetrators and enablers of corruption also see the consequences of their behavior. Because if not, the incentive is absolutely absent. In the end, you can create all this you have mentioned in the report. But if the judiciary is not willing or not capable or has no legal capacity to really apply the consequences and to put a stop to impunity, we will not end with this problem. And just to finish and to open the discussion, I think this report is very important, and the sectors you mentioned, and I like this sector-oriented approach together with a wide or broader approach in terms of general addressing the problem. These sectors you mentioned, particularly public procurement, infrastructure, and land and urbanization policies, will be the focus in the post-COVID era in terms of corruption. We are already seeing in many countries governments saying that they are paying for vaccines or purchasing vaccines that do not exist. And we don't know when and where and how they will be possible to be applied to the population. But they are already, in many countries, saying, yes, we have already bought 1 million of doses or 11 millions of doses. We are not sure about the price, $3 to $4. I'm talking about real examples. Well, it's a huge amount of public resources. We have to be very careful there. It's not just ventilators or masks or tests. Now we have another huge issue there. Infrastructure, of course, because it will be, and it is already being seen in some countries, the way in which countries are trying to mobilize economy in this recession. which is terrible for many countries. And of course, infrastructure mobilized very quickly the construction area and produce the mobilization or the activation, let's say, of the whole economy. So we have to pay attention to that. And also land and urbanization and the zonifications in city. One of the things that will be with us forever is home working. We are working now in squares in a screen. And this means in many important cities in the world, a vast amount of home office which will be vacant, with all the consequences in terms of the rezonification of urban disposition of the cities, with mobilization of people to faraway areas. And this has been an area very prone to corruption in many, many countries, because having the information beforehand means that you can make huge amounts of money. So I think this is very well selected as the target of the report. And of course, I would like to see in your programs now and from now on, specific budget lines, specific express requirement for governments to hold themselves to account, to have accountability and transparency rules in place to guarantee that the effort the World Bank is doing with these programs goes to those in need, because that's the objective: fighting poverty, fighting for prosperity. So thank you very much. There are many things interesting in the report, and there will be opportunity to talk and to work together. Civil society organizations are here to work with you in order to guarantee accountability and transparency. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delia. We have a broad audience from across the world via Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and World Bank Live. I would like to advise our audience to please post your questions online, and we will try to respond to as many questions as we can. Again, I want to say thank you, Delia, for those useful interventions. We sure will take on board the very useful advice that you provided. Just to remind our audience that our new report, Enhancing Government Effectiveness and Transparency, the Fight Against Corruption, was the culmination of 18 months of research. The report draws on the cumulative knowledge of experts, both inside and outside of the World Bank. We'll now start feeding some of the questions. I will be posting the questions to the panelists as well as the presenter. The first question I would like to pose is first to Hada. The question is along this line: should corruption be a market problem rather than merely governance deficiencies, especially those of poor and developing countries? Such a divide that is between market and governance deficiency is no longer practical and tends to localize corruption as first and foremost a domestic issue. While domestic efforts are necessary and of utmost importance, countries with tax havens and highly sophisticated bank secrecy laws share the responsibility for incentivizing the deposit of corrupted assets and portfolios in their jurisdiction. So the question then is, can the World Bank and UNODC act beyond the agency of its stakeholders' interests? The global agenda on corruption needs to be rejuvenated. Okay, I will ask Hada to first take a crack at this, We will also come from the World Bank side. I will make a few comments, and I would also like Delia to weigh in. Haida.
Thank you for the question. Is your question, should this be left to the market? Have I heard you well?
The person asking the question, Diego, was just providing a context about market and country context. But I think we should actually look at the question as, is corruption a domestic issue that we focus just on putting laws and regulations and institutions in place domestically, or this is really a global issue? And the point I think that the person who asked the question was making is that there are all these countries, tax havens. Okay, you've heard about the Panama Papers and the rest of them. You have all these country havens, tax havens that provide opportunities for people to be able to hide ill-gotten wealth. Okay, so the question is then, what can the World Bank, UNODC do to make this a truly global fight?
Well, I do believe that corruption remains a major global challenge. It's affecting all countries, but is hurting developing countries in particular more than any other country. And specifically, in the case of the COVID crisis, it is hurting developing countries more than ever. There needs to be a lot of work at the domestic level with institutions, with legislation, with communities, so that there is a raised and heightened awareness with the market, with the private sector and NGOs, but there needs to be also cooperation among governments. We need to expand collaboration among the different international organizations and entities with civil society and the private sector also globally, and not just at the local level. Actually, since the World Bank President Wolfensohn, since his Cancer of Corruption speech in 1996, this has helped put anti-corruption on the development agenda. And the bank has continued to develop its knowledge and assistance to address this threat. So I would really like the bank to increase this work and actively engage with and bring its expertise, knowledge, and convening power to the intergovernmental policy discussions within the UN Convention Against Corruption and the forthcoming UNGAS, because we have a lot of evidence that you cannot fight corruption only within the local context, but there is a cross-border context, and there needs to be an international stance against corruption. And I think there is momentum for that. And we have shown under the STAR initiative what can be achieved by a partnership between UNODC and the World Bank. Since the World Bank and UNODC established the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative more than 10 years ago, STAR has assisted many countries in developing their legal frameworks, their institutional expertise, and the skills necessary to trace and return stolen assets. And this tracing and returning stolen assets happens cross-border. So I think it is very important that we continue to provide support to the different governments as needed at the local level, but we need to continue this dialogue and the implementation of the convention and the breaking down the silos between institutions and between member states, because it's actually today, in particular in times of crisis, where it becomes more important than ever that we break down silos, we strengthen the synergies and build on the complementarity of the different approaches of different institutions toward a more strategic use of resources in low-income countries. So we have, for instance, launched the Colombo Commentary on the Jakarta Statement of Principles for Anti-Corruption. This will assist policymakers and decision makers with practical guidance on how to strengthen the independence of anti-corruption bodies in their national legal and policy frameworks in line with the convention. So there needs to be work locally in strengthening institutions, and there needs to be work internationally and region.
Thank you so much, Delia. I really would like to echo what you've said. Our managing director, when she made her opening remarks, made a reference to the new World Bank initiatives to reaffirm our commitment to fighting corruption. The paper was published in December last year. One of the major initiatives that we set out in that paper is really the need to take the fight against corruption to the tax haven countries as well. So we recognize what the person who asked the question asked, that you cannot focus on fighting corruption just in the client countries or in developing countries, but you have to take the fight to a number of other countries that are providing safe haven for ill-gotten money. And then to be able to do that effectively, we have to leverage our convening power, as Ada said. So we really look forward to working with UNODC and other global partners, Transparency International and governments to really ensure that we can get, for instance, countries that are currently providing tax havens and have all these secretive laws that allow people to keep safely ill-gotten wealth, to really bring about more transparency and help in the fight against corruption. But I would like to ask Delia to also weigh in on this. Delia, you might be muted.
No, it's okay. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, please.
Okay, yeah, it was okay. I was saying that you have in mind our map of the index of perception of corruption, where some countries are in yellow, they are perceived as transparent in their public sector, and there are lots of red countries where the problem of corruption is. Well, this is just looking at the perception of the public sector countries. Those yellow countries become red, really, and main actors in the problem of corruption when we talk about illicit financial flows, because the money that goes out of the country because of corruption in Africa, Latin America, or Asia Pacific ends in the city in London, Switzerland, and many other countries, or in the luxury industry, or in real estate industry, or in art industry. So these countries are equally responsible for the global problem of corruption because they create the conditions to facilitate those corrupt guys in the red countries to enjoy the profits of corruption. So these countries have a strong responsibility in this. And this weekend, we have just seen the FinCEN files, the leak. And it is clear that we have to address a very important problem, which is when gatekeepers, particularly in these countries, became really enablers of corruption. And either we tackle that problem or we will not solve the problem of illicit financial flows, because there are many people working to facilitate the enjoyment of corrupt profits. And we have to stop that. And the other thing that we need in order to do that is beneficial ownership transparency. And you mentioned that as one of the points because it is central. As Bernard mentioned, or Rania, I don't remember who of you mentioned, there has been lots of progress in that area. But still, we have just registers without the needed verification of the data that is provided. You know, for instance, that Global Witness conducted a review or an assessment on the UK register. And they found out, for instance, just to mention one thing, that there are 4,000 beneficial owners that are under 2 years old. So this is the group that I mentioned as the smart kids, because if they are the beneficial owners of 4,000 companies, we have a problem there. And the problem is verification of the information and to make it public. I know the reports points out to this balance that should be made, particularly in Europe with the GDPR and the data protection rules, which are much more strong or robust in comparison with other parts of the world. The balance should be established, but we need to make this beneficial ownership register public. That will be the only possibility in order not to have Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse as the beneficial owners of companies.
Thank you, Delia. So we have another kind of questions that I think is important, especially going forward. We see a lot of countries that are decentralizing service delivery to local levels or subnational governance. And there are questions from some of the audience that really pertains to instruments that can be used in tackling corruption at subnational levels, for example, in local governments in developing countries. So I would like the TTLs for this report, Rajnin and Bernard, to first tell us if they particularly identified some tools that they think can be very effective at the local level or subnational government level in tackling corruption. Bernard, Rajnin? And then we'll come to Delia.
Sure, Ed, thank you. So I think the report also has 2 case studies on this. And the tools that have been quite effective at the local governance level are those of citizen engagement, social audits, surveys, setting up grievance redress mechanisms, participatory budgeting. And these collectively, all the social audit instruments have been quite effective at the local level in engaging citizens and in building bottom-up accountability. In a number of local governance projects driven and by international organizations, as well as community-driven projects by the World Bank, these are mostly the tools that are being used. And a number of subnational governments have also adopted a pilot project to scale up to the national level and moved on from using some of these tools and setting up systems which are transparent, grievance redress systems, which people can log into through mobile phones, through internet, through paper-based applications. They have made this available, and they have also conducted a lot of learning events and awareness building events for people to know how they can participate and hold the government accountable for greater transparency. And so these are some of the things that come together to address corruption at the local level and to factor in all the requirements at the local level rather than have a top-down planning. It becomes a bottom-up planning and accountability approach.
Perhaps just to complement that, in the infrastructure chapter, we see a couple of examples. The Cost Initiative, for example, which uses similar, which built on the ideal of integrity pacts, which Delia mentioned, but which integrates multi-stakeholder accountability, is something that can also be applied at a regional level or at a local level to help ensure there is transparency around public infrastructure contracts. But the other thing is, in the case on Colombia and open contracting, that is one where through the platform and common data standards, that the regional governments have been the ones that have benefited perhaps the most, because there is now greater competition in contracting, more opportunities for women contractors, vendors to participate. And that is something where it's really, again, cities and regional governments that have benefited the most from this initiative from the central government to have promote open contracting.
Thank you, Rajnin and Bernard. So we have one question also from the audience, and this is about the proceeds of corruption. The context is this: when somebody is put before a judge for corruption, the person can be sentenced to prison, okay, for some years, and then the person can then get out of prison and enjoy the proceeds of that corruption. So then recovery of stolen money or asset recovery is really very important. So the audience who pose the question would like Adi to answer the question in terms of what is UNODC going to do to help countries to further strengthen asset recovery. And I would also like Delia to come in and express the views of Transparency International in terms of what more could the international community do in terms of strengthening asset recovery. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much. Asset recovery is recognized as a fundamental principle of the UN Convention Against Corruption. The need to fast-track asset recovery is also part of SDG 16. One of the first steps when dealing with asset recovery cases is going after the money. Because, as you rightly pointed out, unless we are successful in taking away the proceeds of crime from the corrupt, we will not be successful in our response. So it's all about getting the money back. To address this complex issue, the World Bank and UNODC created the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. Through STAR, we work to support countries in building their capacity to trace, to freeze, to seize, and ultimately return stolen assets. When I arrived at UNODC this year, I started the development of a new Africa strategy, which has a strong focus on tackling corruption and illicit financial flows. The African Union will be one of our close partners in implementing the strategy, which we will be presenting soon. So I think for return of assets and for returning the money, we have to develop the local capacity for tracing, but we have to develop the international instruments and the international cooperation so that the money can come from abroad, and there needs to be the tools to monitor this and to actually hold countries accountable and governments accountable. And here I refer to the comments, the very important comments made by Delia Rubio on the need to hold countries accountable and the need to really have in place the legislation that once you have the evidence and once there is a case of a very evident illicit financial flows, countries can recover their assets. But this needs a lot of work from us and a lot of support that we should be providing to member states, including tools, investigation, and improving the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Ada. Delia, if you'd like to weigh in.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with Ada and with Geita, and I would like to add just a comment, because I think related to local question that we were asked by the public, the audience, that Rania and Bernard has put just the right accent and stress on the engagement of citizens at this bottom-up approach when we deal with local level. It's much easier and has been much effective, even with integrity packs in small projects. People get involved, and that participation and social audit and inclusiveness is the response. And I would like to mention also, as part of the OGP group, that we have launched now a very strong program on OGP at the local level. Normally we work with the national level. Coming back to this question on stolen assets recovery, it is key, as we were mentioning. Mutual legal assistance tools have to be modernized according to the time we are living. We have in many countries legislation that is created or informed by the principles of 29th century, and we are applying that procedures in a world where the money goes from one country to other with the speed of a click in a computer. So we cannot fight effectively to these illicit financial flows if we keep on going with the written procedure, the judge, the foreign office of the receiving country, then the judge there, then there was a problem with the paper and came back. in that time, money disappears and many people is enjoying the profits of that. So we have to work together to have the proper procedural rules, to have the proper cooperation, both internationally and nationally, in terms of agencies sharing information and working together. And we also have, and our chapters are doing that, as civil society, to bring these cases to the court. You might remember that our chapter in France was the one responsible to bringing Obiang to the court in order to recover the assets that the family was enjoying in France, and we succeed in that. So this is important, coordination, but putting in place the timeliness and modern, and this goes to GovTech and digitalization if necessary, in terms of mutual legal assistance.
I would like, Edward?
Yes, please, Adam.
I would like to add something here. While I agree with everything that has been said, I think also it's very important to work with banks. Banks, law firms, accounting firms, and other businesses who may serve as enablers and facilitators of money laundering and illicit financial flows. They have a role to play. There needs to be a code of conduct. There needs to be a level of accountability. We need to look into what are the tricks of the game and really work with banks and come to an agreement as to how to stop this illicit financial flow and money laundering.
Yeah, and this problem I mentioned, from gatekeepers becoming enablers that you have just mentioned also, has to do with the need to add new authorities or oversight institutions to the last chapter of the report, because supervising authorities of bank should be included as a very important oversight authority in terms of fighting against financial illicit flows.
So a role for central banks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so this is really very interesting. And as I was listening to both Delia and Ada, it was like as if both of you have read the report on the World Bank and new anti-corruption initiatives that MD Mary referred to earlier on in opening remarks. So I really strongly encourage all our audience today to look at a copy of that report and read it. And so we really have an agreement on the areas where we need to collaborate internationally to pursue this anti-corruption agenda. So I think we are of similar mind on these issues. And so very good basis for us to all work together. There is one more final question, I mean, in view of the time, that I would still like I would like us to address, but let's try to see if our team that did the report can address this question with any specific example that they may have found during the research. And the question from the audience is about what about application of rule of law? Okay, and Delia spoke about that eloquently in her reflections. If there are no consequences for bad behavior, no much change will happen. Okay, now I want to ask the TTL for the report if you really found any evidence or some examples of how the application of rule of law really have been helpful in fighting corruption. I know it is very important, but any specific examples that you can share with us today from the research? Rajni Bernard.
Bernard, did you want to go from the justice chapter?
I don't know that there were specific examples. I think from that chapter, except to emphasize the need to make sure that there is application of laws, and that part of the way of doing that is increasing transparency and accountability of the judges and staff throughout the judiciary, so that there can be more citizen engagement to hold the judiciary responsible for implementing and enforcing the laws. So that's some of the primary policy recommendations there.
Okay, Hadab.
I believe that there is a very important element of capacity building. In many countries, you need to build the capacity within the judiciary to train your prosecutors on how to investigate corruption, how to investigate money laundering, how to investigate and qualify the crime itself. This is a complex crime, and it is constantly evolving and developing using technology, using many different and alternative ways. So I believe they are at a disadvantage in many countries where this is for them a type of crime that they have not been trained on, they have not been seeing often. And I think building the capacity, the investigative capacity, the prosecution capacity, not just having the right legislation in place, but building capacity and building awareness among the legislators and the prosecutor and the judicial system at large. And this is something that UNODC considers a priority of our work. We are having our crime congress in Kyoto next March, and I believe that the element of economic crime and the element of dealing with corruption and economic crime, money laundering, illicit financial flows is a very important element that the world is getting together to discuss in the Crime Congress and then later in UNGAS on corruption to see how are we going to move together forward. But there is a lot of investment that is needed and a lot of support that is needed to member states in the area of building the judiciary capacity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ada. We'd like to go back to Delia. I think Delia wants to weigh in, and then the TTLs also want to come in.
I would go to your first message in the report, which is progress is not linear. Effectively, fighting corruption is not running a marathon, everyone going in the same direction, nobody throwing stones at those running. It is a chess game. It is a strategic game. There are other pieces all participating. And what we have seen in terms of the judiciary deciding and applying sanctions is that even in the cases where the judiciary has been effective in their role, what we see is the politicization of the judiciary. So when the government change in a country, the results of the court cases are revised again, and everything is going back. So we have to make the progress sustainable, which is something you mentioned in the report. We need to make progress sustainable. And in terms of stopping impunity, we need not only capacity, as Ghada very well mentioned, but also independence and respect of the resolutions of courts. If not, it will be always going back and forth, according to the political situation in the countries.
And if I could...
Thank you, Bernard. And then Rajni.
Just add that, the chapter on tax, chapter 10, emphasizes that sometimes prosecuting for money laundering may be harder, but that one of the angles is to use tax administrations who are used to at least detecting tax evasion and sometimes have separate courts for tax crimes, to use that as an angle to go after the illicit financial flows and ill-gotten gains by going after the tax crimes. So that's, and I think there's a couple of examples of where that's been used effectively.
Thank you, Bernard. That's really very helpful. Rajni, you want to add something quickly?
Nothing except that we also did weigh the pros and cons, and there was a lot of discussion about corrupt judges, corrupt judges and the system, and how do you go stepwise in building capacity, raising awareness at all levels, including the prosecutors, something that has already been mentioned by Ghada, so I don't want to repeat it, but yeah, there is a huge issue of corrupt judges themselves. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. As you have heard from various speakers, corruption is a development challenge that continues to require attention. As Delia just said, progress is not linear. We need to sustain effort. We've also had that corruption is really multifaceted. And we have corruption in all sectors. We even have it in the worst of times, such as COVID-19 pandemic era. So then one single tool cannot be used to solve this problem. We have to rely on a variety of tools and practices. So there are practices and tools that have worked in specific contexts and which can be adapted in other contexts. Awareness of these tools are important for all stakeholders, including reformers in government, the private sector. I think Delia emphasizes the importance of the private sector in fighting corruption, the civil society organizations, the media, and citizens. Then, as Hada, Delia, and TTS also alluded to, the rule of law is very important. Why technology is being used to facilitate corruption, some of our staff like to constantly remind us of that. We can also take advantage of digital development to fight corruption, tools like GovTech. Although corruption has been an intractable challenge, we cannot abandon the fight to eradicate it, as to do so will be detrimental to the well-being of many people across the globe. We all have a role to play in the fight against corruption. And if we all work together, we all put in the efforts that is required, we can win the fight. Let's keep the conversation going online. Shortly, a recording of this event will be made available on World Bank Live. I want to seize this opportunity to again thank Hada, Delia, Mary, Rajni, and Bernard, and everyone who tuned into this event today. Also, many thanks to the Malaysian government for their great partnership with the World Bank Group. As mentioned by Managing Director Mary in her opening remarks, the report we launched today flows from the work of our Malaysia hub and valuable partnership with the Malaysian government and its people. A key area of focus for the hub is government effectiveness, productivity, and transparency. And these issues are important for Malaysia's own development efforts towards reaching high-income nation status and for other countries with similar development ambitions. Again, thank you for your participation, and please stay safe. Let's continue the conversation online. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Congratulations.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you, Gada.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you, Hada. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay.